This afternoon, police confirmed that remains discovered in a Kent woodland are those of Sarah Everard, the 33-year-old who went missing on March the 3rd in South London. The horrific murder of Sarah Everard has shone a spotlight on the epidemic of violence against women in Britain, with thousands of women speaking up about the harassment they have faced. It's also raised serious questions about the Metropolitan Police. The man suspected of the murder is a serving police officer who had been reported days earlier for alleged indecent exposure. On tonight's Tysky Sour, we'll be discussing this week's horrific events and what they tell us about power, misogyny and violence in modern day Britain. I'm of course joined by Dalia Gebrial. Thank you for joining me this evening.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's not a great news day, but we are here to unpack it and to talk about what the pathways out are.
Absolutely. I mean, it has caused, an incredible outpouring, in fact. And we'll be discussing whether this has become something like a new Me Too moment or slightly later in the show. We will have a couple of guests later on the show. They're two volunteers with the Good Lad Initiative, and they lead workshops with teenage boys about sexual violence, or that speaks to something which so many people have been bringing up at the moment, which is that the responsibility should fall on men to tackle this pandemic of violence and harassment. We'll also close by discussing a completely different story, which is Labour's fence sitting on the question of nurses' pay. We do want to get more people watching this show, so do share the show link, tweet on the hashtag Tysky Sour, comment under the Twitch stream, and we will be reading your super chats throughout the show. Sarah Everard, a 33-year-old marketing executive, went missing on the evening of March the 3rd after leaving a friend's house near Clapham Common. The following day, her boyfriend, who had arranged to meet Sarah Everard that evening, alerted the police and a nationwide search began. 6 days later, on March the 9th, a 48-year-old police officer named Wayne Cousins was arrested in Kent, first on suspicion of kidnapping and then later on suspicion of her murder. Now, according to The Sun, investigators were led to Cousins after a car allegedly linked to him was spotted on a motorist's dash cam near to where Sarah Everard was last seen on the night of Wednesday, March the 3rd. They cite a source suggesting the officer, who they understand had been working for police that day, may have used his warrant card to entice Everard towards his car, with one theory suggesting that the COVID lockdown could have been a pretext to begin a conversation. This is, of course, fairly speculative at this point. It has since, though, been revealed that 2 allegations of indecent exposure had been levelled against Cousins on the 28th of February, just 3 days before Sarah Everard's disappearance. It was not until this Wednesday, after he had been arrested on suspicion of murder, that Cousins was also arrested on suspicion of indecent exposure related to that prior complaint. Because of this delay, there is now an investigation underway into whether the Metropolitan Police properly investigated that first incident, that first report about indecent exposure. Reports suggest the officer was still working for the Met on the 3rd of March, which would imply the complaint did not lead to any suspension. Finally, when it comes to questions about the Metropolitan Police, there is also one other incident this week which requires answers. On Thursday, Cousins was taken to hospital due to head injuries he'd received in custody. The police have said he was alone in his cell when the injury took place. He has since returned to police custody. Now, we're going to discuss the broader issues surrounding policing and violence against women a little bit later in the show, and also the social media response. First, though, Dalia, can I just get your comment on the specific events we've witnessed this week? It's obviously tragic, frightening, and there's also lots of reasons to have concerns about the role of the Metropolitan Police in this.
I mean, of course, we're all deeply shaken by this news. It's an appalling story, and the arrest of an officer on suspicion here has brought to light a lot of conversations that have been happening, since the summer last year, but also much further back before that, about, police accountability and all of these things. And I think, as we've seen on social media this week, people who have been, made vulnerable by our system, vulnerability is not like an inherent thing. Women, queer people, they spend a huge amount of time and effort trying to do all of these things to try and make them feel in control of what happens to them. And it's something that's drummed into us from a very young age, and it's incessant, it's exhausting, it's unfair. It dramatically impacts your quality of life. And I think what's sad is that for so long, this violence, this anticipation of violence has been portrayed as sort of some kind of natural reality of being a woman or a queer person, right? So that's just how it is. And to demand or expect to be treated differently is unrealistic. It's pie in the sky, or it's against nature. You know, I can't count the number of times that I've been told that, you know, an outfit or something is like, you know, go walking into a lion's den wearing meat. You know, I've literally had that sentence told to me multiple times. That this demand for things to be different has to happen in our imagination first. And I feel like hopefully that is, you know, beginning to unfold. And, you know, whatever the details of this particular case turn out to be, that conversation around the relationship of the police to this kind of harm, to these kinds of violences, to the harm of people in our communities, and the fact that, you know, police are clearly not who we rely on to keep ourselves safe in our everyday lives, is a really urgent one.
I mean, we're going to mainly be talking about sort of the broader issues this case raises throughout the show. And before we move on to that, I do just mention what we do know about the suspect now, or what we seem to know about the suspect now. Of course, more details will come out about the incident in the days and weeks and months ahead. According to the Times, Cousins had previously worked for the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, guarding Dungeness Nuclear Power Station and other sensitive sites. The Sun report that the 48-year-old father of two joined the Met during a recruitment drive for armed police officers following the 2017 terror attacks. They suggest he had previously spent 10 years as a Territorial Army reservist. Lots of people have been sort of pointing out that this, you know, was a police officer, was also an armed police officer. So someone with an enormous amount of power and responsibility and authority due to the job he held, which is why I think people are finding the fact that this man has been arrested on suspicion of murder, especially terrifying. Let's move on to the social media response to all of this, because it has been, you know, enormous. The outpouring both of grief, but also of people sharing their own experiences of harassment and violence, and also what they believe, you know, we need to do to change this in this country. I want to start with one of the first tweets to go viral, which was this from lawyer Harriet Johnson. She wrote, "Every woman you know has taken a longer route, has doubled back on herself, has pretended to dawdle by a shop window, has held her keys in her hand, has made a fake phone call, has rounded a corner and run. Every woman you know has walked home scared. Every woman you know." Now that clearly struck a chord because it was shared 38,000 times. Lots of people sharing it, obviously, with their own experiences. We'll just go through some more of the viral tweets. There were obviously thousands and thousands. I'm sure you've been looking through many of them yourselves. One I want to bring up is from NHS worker Kate Jarman. So she wrote, "Like this tweet, if as a woman you've walked home with your keys in your hand in case you need to use them in self-defense. If you faked being on the phone as you walk past the man coming towards you. If you've changed your route. If you started to run in fear. And like this tweet, if that's been because of the behavior of men, whether it's men's behavior needs to change, not women's." We also have a tweet here from our own, Novara's own Ash Sarkar, who tweeted, "I can't remember the first time I was targeted on the street, mostly because it started so young. And I can't think of a time when it wasn't a part of just being in public as a woman. It happened when I was in school uniform. It still happens in broad daylight as well as at night." And finally, Helen Barnard, who is director of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, pointed out, you know, the very important point in response to the people who say, well, you should get a cab home, don't walk home at night. She says, there is actually no safe way to get home. So she tweets, "Get a taxi. So many nights finishing work late and getting in a taxi, calling home so the driver could hear me tell someone where I was, tracking the route to judge if I was being taken the right way, wondering if I could kick open the door if needed. It's exhausting." Now, I mean, as I say, there are thousands and thousands of these tweets. Dalia, I want your thoughts on how meaningful this moment could be. Obviously, it has lots of resonances, I suppose, with I Can't Breathe, with the response to the death of George Floyd, also with the Me Too movement, where one revelation about a particularly powerful man prompted many, many women to talk about their experiences of harassment. And we can talk about how effective or ineffective that movement was. But what do you make of this outpouring?
I mean, I think that it's important to kind of make it when a voice feels collective, it can really help. I think that what struck me so much about these tweets, and all of these women talking about, like I said earlier, the strategies that they take in order to try and feel in control of what's going to happen to them, is that it tells me that women turn to themselves to keep themselves safe. They don't turn, and their communities and their friends who they, call before they get into a cab, or they call, on before they start their journey home, that we actually don't rely on the police to keep them safe. And, it's something that we hear a lot, but it's not something that actually is what happens on the ground. And whether it's, carrying hairspray around, keys between their knuckles, checking with friends. I could probably put a mortgage down on a house with the amount of money I spend on Ubers because I'm scared to walk alone at night. So, the police don't actually make women feel safer. They're not who we turn to try and feel safe. And any woman, queer person who's actually been through the system when they've experienced a harm, whether it's harassment, whether it's stalking, other gender-based violences, when women have gone to institutions that they are told are there to protect them and been like, I know that this man is going to hurt me. And there is, can tell any woman that's done that can tell you that police sure as hell aren't useful when that's the case. So, but I think also, with a lot of these messages, with a lot of these tweets, I think it's also really careful, really important to tread quite a difficult line here, which is, it's very important to talk about how, we do all these strategies to keep us safe. And even when we do them, we still can be subject to harassment and violence. But I think it's really important to not center this conversation around questions of innocence, because it implies that there are some women who can't take those strategies, whether they are sex workers or they work in the nighttime economy, or they're women who just love to stay out late and wear what the hell they want to wear, enjoy their night, somehow, didn't take the right precautionary measures that they should have taken to prevent harm. And I think, especially when it comes to harm experienced by the police, and obviously, we don't know the details of this particular case, but there is a long tradition of women talking about experiencing sexual violence or experiencing harm at the hands of a police officer and not being able to actually do anything about it. It's especially important to avoid that question of innocence, because it suggests that if you're not innocent, then violence or harm that you're subjected to by the police, whether it's on the street or in a cell, is somehow deserved or not concerning or par of the course. So I think that these kind of tweets have done a lot of work to, I think, bring realization to the kind of context that women are living in. But I think it's really important, again, to center on the systemic causes of this and the conditions that make women vulnerable, rather than kind of what behaviors women should take on in order to try and assuage their vulnerability, even though inevitably, because you want to feel some control over your life, you do them. I do them all the time. So yeah, I think that's a kind of convoluted response, but I'm still kind of muddling my way through trying to think about quite a difficult situation.
There's also, I mean, some people might say, oh, it's Twitter, it's not representative. In this case, it clearly is. Twitter isn't always representative. Here it is. There was a YouGov poll, which was released this week, or at least was widely shared this week, which showed that 97% of women aged between 18 and 24 said they had been sexually harassed. And when asking women of all ages, 80% said they had experienced sexual harassment in public places. Dalia, I want to ask you about a sort of specific subset of tweets, which were either sort of men asking, what can we do differently, or women providing suggestions as to what men can do differently. The ones that I particularly remember that got shared a lot were specifically, if you are not an abusive man, how can you make it clear you're not following someone? How can you make it clear? How can you make sure that you're not making women worried about walking at night? And that was things like crossing the road. If you're walking behind a woman, don't walk behind a woman for a long period of time, either overtake or go in a different direction. Definitely don't walk behind a woman down an alleyway, for example. What did you make of that sort of practical advice? What do you think was missing? Also, I suppose, what would you say to any men in our audience who want to, as little as, who don't want to be part of the problem? Let's put it like that.
Well, this is a real collective issue. It's not something that can be resolved by just adjusting individual behaviors. I think what the things around, cross the street, if a woman is on her own, the things that I guess that kind of speaks to is that, and I think one thing that the things that have happened on Twitter really were bringing light to was that, when we hear about the statistics of when women have experienced sexual harassment or experienced sexual violence, oftentimes, the focus is on when the actual violence has occurred. That is what actually gets recorded. But what women are kind of saying here is that actually the issue is not just when the instances happen. The issue is the constant vigilance and exhaustion of anticipation of violence and anticipation of harassment. And that stuff doesn't get recorded in data. You don't have statistics for, how often do you as a woman fear harassment on the street, because it kind of is all the time. So I think that kind of alertness to this idea that this doesn't just affect women's lives when it actually happens. It affects our lives because we spend a lot of money, we spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of energy restructuring our lives, and our entire relationship to public space is very different because of the anticipation, the constant anxiety around that. So I think that that's, a really interesting kind of angle to take it from. And I think that there is, all the goodwill in the world there to sort of try and make individual changes to kind of ease that a little bit. But I also think that, and there are people who are much smarter than me who kind of really deal with this question of gender-based violence, and what are the root causes of gender-based violence, and what are the adequate systems that can be put in place to both prevent gender-based violence and also allow for healing and recognition if and when that does occur.
And we will be coming back to the issue of how men can respond sort of in a bit more depth later in the show. And I want to begin now talk about how this movement, this response isn't just online, or at least people hoped it wouldn't be just online, because a protest had been planned for tomorrow at 6 p.m. On Clapham Common in southwest London, which is close to where it's believed Sarah Everard, was abducted. Now, the Met Police provoked outrage by indicating they would not allow the protest to go ahead due to coronavirus legislation, and threatened organisers with hefty fines if they were to go ahead with the demo against their advice. One of the organisers of the Reclaim These Streets protests spoke to Radio 4 this morning.
Safety's been a priority from the get-go. It would be ironic to organise a vigil to think about women's safety in public spaces without also thinking about the health and safety aspects. So right from the get-go, we've been hugely proactive on that. Every piece of literature that we've created and put out has asked people to wear masks and emphasise the importance of social distancing. We chose Clapham Common in part because it's such a big, wide open space. And as a common, it doesn't have fences around it, so there's no need for people to bunch together and crowd to get in or out. So we were trying to be very thoughtful. We had QR codes so that people could do track and trace, and just really trying to work out how we can do this in a really safe way.
I suppose what the police might say from a policing point of view is that other groups of people who felt very strongly about other things might then take this as a cue that they could do the same thing, and that would mean that a lot more people were on the streets and coming to and from this kind of event than the government wants at the moment, and then would be legal.
I do understand that. I think that our right to peacefully assemble is an important one, and that when people do feel strongly, and when groups of people's rights are under threat because they can't walk on the street safely, or as we saw last summer, they experience racism and wanted to assert that their Black Lives Matter. I think that these are, our right to protest and our right to assemble in those contexts is a human right.
Now, just before we went live, it was announced that the appeal that those protest organisers took to the High Court has failed. Unfortunately, from my perspective, we can get a statement from the judge, and this is from the BBC report of that result, which came just before we went live, as I say. So the BBC write, in the ruling on Friday, Mr. Justice Holgate refused an application by Reclaim These Streets for the High Court to make an interim declaration that any ban on outdoor gatherings under COVID rules was subject to the right to protest. The judge also refused to make a declaration that an alleged policy by the Met Police of prohibiting all protests irrespective of the specific circumstances was unlawful. lawful. Organisers of Reclaim These Streets said that by forcing them to cancel the vigil, the Met Police would be silencing thousands of women. Now, this is, I mean, you could say it's a difficult issue, or you could not. I mean, you can see what's happened here. Obviously, it looks terrible for the Metropolitan Police to be banning this particular vigil, especially as we've spoken about, because of the questions that should be raised about the Metropolitan Police in this particular case. The organisers of that march, as you saw in that clip, have also been very clear this would be COVID secure. I presume the reason why the judge has ruled in favour of the police, though, is that the coronavirus legislation is actually fairly sweeping. There have been lots of people who have suggested that whilst much of it was completely necessary, there should have been things such as opt-outs for protests, the sort of things which are essential for our democratic life should not have been subject to the same restrictions as going to the pub or any other kind of gathering. The argument, the counter argument would be that it's a slippery slope. If you allowed one protest, and everyone can call their party a protest, and then you've got a bit of a problem. Dalia, what do you make of this? I mean, obviously it's a real shame that this demo can't go ahead. I don't know if people will still turn up, but I mean, the organisers have definitely, I think, probably taken to heart the fact that now this has been ruled illegal. They could be liable for thousands of pounds if they don't cancel it. Do you think the balance between, public health and political expression has been gotten wrong here?
I mean, we had many of these similar conversations in the summer with the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think that the point that was made there was that, we are talking about, obviously, we're in a major public health crisis. And obviously that means that we are doing everything that we can in order to prevent harm against people. And, that is kind of, I guess, the key question here. But the argument that was made during the Black Lives Matter protest, which I was certainly, agreed with, was that we are also talking about an urgent need to talk. We are also engaging with an urgent need to talk about and address and recognize a form of harm that is systemic, that is ever present, that for women and, and for people of color is very, very urgent and it's very immediate. And so I really do think that this kind of this clamping down, and this is part of a broader, which we'll come to a bit later, perhaps, this is part of a broader trend that we are seeing with, the crime bill, which massively curtails the ability of people inside or outside of coronavirus times to assert their right to protest. It massively restricts the kinds of protests and the spaces in which people can protest. And, this all seems to be part of a wider ideological trend. And that brings me back again to the question of what are the police there to protect? They can't, take accountability when, and this is not talking just about the specific case, but the many, many backlog of cases where women have experienced abuse and people of color, people have experienced abuse at the hands of the police and have not been able to seek recognition or accountability for that. But when it comes to stopping women from gathering in an outdoor park with, very adequate measures taken in order to prevent the spread of the virus, holding it outside, wearing masks, having QR codes. And you can't tell me that the issue is public transport, because you have lots and lots of people going on public transport every day for work. So the question therefore becomes, what is the police really there for? They've got all this vim in the world against a memorial for a woman who has been killed in the most egregious and horrific way, and where women want to raise their voices to talk about how this is a systemic issue. But when it comes to, protecting a statue from some graffiti, they have 10 years in prison right in their back pocket.
We have a comment from Richard Mischuk, tweets on the hashtag Tiski Sour. Such a good point just now from Dalia on Tiski Sour about what it's like for women to always be in a state of anticipation of violence. I can't begin to imagine how exhausting that must be. I think that's probably a sentiment shared by many men who've been on Twitter this week, sort of seeing that outpouring. We spoke about sort of the concerns about the police in this particular case, in the case of violence against women. We're going to talk quite specifically about that now, because the Sarah Everard case has raised difficult questions for the Metropolitan Police. The man arrested on suspicion of Everard's murder, Wayne Couzens, is himself a police officer. Even more concerning, Couzens has been reported to the police 3 days prior to Everard's abduction. He was accused of indecent exposure. Now, given it's understood he continued working as a police officer after that complaint, questions are being raised about that initial investigation. Was it properly investigated by the police, by his colleagues? Finally, the fact that Cousins was taken from custody to hospital with head injuries raises serious questions about the professionalism of the service. I know not people will not have sympathy with this man, and they should not, but this is not a good way to conduct an investigation, whether it was committed by himself or by someone else. Obviously, we don't want to speculate on the details of this particular case, but rather use this as an opportunity to remind ourselves of the other recent incidents which shine light on the problematic relationship of the police to gender-based violence. And it's quite shocking, actually. It does make I suppose the actions of the police, or the suspicions we have of the police, not particularly surprising given their recent history. I want to start with an article from 2019. This was by Alexandra Heel, who conducted a really important investigation into allegations of domestic violence against serving police officers. This was for the Bureau for Investigative Journalism. Now, Heel reported on the extent to which police officers were themselves subject to complaints about domestic violence. She writes, police officers and staff across the UK were reported for alleged domestic abuse almost 700 times in the 3 years up to April 2018, according to Freedom of Information responses, more than 4 times a week on average. The real figure is likely to be much higher, as data was only provided by 37 of the UK's 48 police forces, that's including specialist forces. Now, Heel also reported, and this is particularly worrying, that victims of alleged domestic abuse consistently accounted difficulties when reporting their alleged abusers. That's if their alleged abusers were themselves police officers. So Heel writes, from across the country, we heard claims that alleged abusers got their partners repeatedly arrested, stalked them in cars, or warned them there was no point going to the police because the force was a family. Some were too scared to ever report it. For those that did go to the police, the experience only served to traumatize them further, they say. They feel their partner's colleagues failed to adequately follow up on serious allegations and that they were discouraged from making statements. Some complained about their treatment, but the complaints were not upheld. Statistics also sort of back up. So lots of this article, which I do recommend you go and read, is based on interviews with people who have had difficulties themselves complaining against police officers. But it also has the statistics to back this up. It's not just personal experience. She writes, beyond the number of allegations, the figures suggest reports about alleged abuse by police are treated differently. Just 3.9% in England and Wales ended in conviction, compared with 6.2% among the general population. Less than a quarter of reports resulted in any sort of professional discipline. Greater Manchester Police, one of the country's biggest forces, secured just 1 conviction out of 79 reports over the 3-year period. Now, as I say, we don't want to speculate on what has happened in this particular case, but if it does turn out that the police did not properly investigate Cousins for alleged indecent exposure, this context suggests, that might not be a surprise. More generally, when it comes to how police investigate violence against women, we should talk about the murder of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry, who was stabbed to death tragically and horrifically at a park in Wembley in June last year. Now, back in June, the mother of the 2 sisters, Mina Smallman, complained about the Met's response to her daughter's disappearance. Smallman said she had personally had to organise the search for her daughters after the police did not act when she reported them missing. It was, in fact, Nicole Smallman's boyfriend who found the bodies and the murder weapon, not the police officers. What is most shocking about this story, and what you might have heard about, is when police arrived at the scene, 2 of them posed for selfies with the women's dead bodies. It was 2 members of the Metropolitan Police posed with the dead bodies of the women whose murder they were supposed to be investigating. Now, it's important to remember, this wasn't in the 1960s, this wasn't in the 1980s, this was 2020. Now, at the time, the BBC conducted a harrowing interview with Mina Smallman, so she's the mother, about the incident.
The lead person said, I don't know how to tell you this, but police officers were taking selfies and posing for pictures with your dead daughters. In the Deep South, when they used to lynch people and you would see smiling faces around a hanging dead body. Those police officers dehumanised our children. If ever we needed an example of how toxic it has become, those police officers felt so safe, so untouchable, that they felt they could take photographs.
Really, really difficult interview to listen to. Now, Cressida Dick, who is the head of the Metropolitan Police, said at the time that the alleged actions of the police officers were disgusting and would be condemned by the entire police force. Mina Smallman, who you saw in that video, also explained to the BBC why she thought the police didn't initiate a search immediately after her daughters were reported missing. So this is from the BBC. Smallman says the police were making assumptions when they didn't immediately respond when the sisters were first reported missing. I knew instantly why they didn't care. They didn't care because they looked at my daughter's address and thought they knew who she was, a black woman who lives on a council estate. Now, I mean, Dalia, that's the stories I've just run through, which sort of, you know, the systematic failure, it seems, of the police to investigate domestic abuse by their own officers, and then this completely, you know, appalling response to this murder of two young women. We have heard, sort of in response to what's happened this week, calls for, you know, a greater police presence on our streets to make women feel safer. There'll clearly be many women who don't feel safer by having more police on our streets. I mean, what do you make of I suppose the role of the Metropolitan Police, especially, and the police more broadly, when it comes to gender-based violence?
I mean, I think that the way that in the interview that we just heard, that idea of the police looked at my daughter's address and thought they knew who she was, the implication there is that she wasn't this, that they assumed that they weren't these sort of innocent victims, that because they were black, because they were working class, that somehow violence is something that is just part of the course for them. It's really important, as I sort of mentioned earlier, to think about this in that broader context of the crime bill that has recently passed, which is giving police absolutely unprecedented powers to restrict protest, you know, an extension of what is being currently used to criminalize the vigil being held, that was going to be held for Sarah. The crime bill has increased, you know, the sentence for causing a damage to a statue to 10 years, right? We then look at the fact that even beyond Sarah's case, we have ample evidence that police abusers are systematically protected by the system. And that, you know, you outline that in the article earlier, and I would encourage people to go and read that article, which begs the question, what is the purpose of that system? And, you know, think about the kind of culture that exists, that police officers feel emboldened to take pictures of the corpses of two dead women and share them on a WhatsApp group. I think it was a WhatsApp group, but it was shared essentially. So thinking about those two things, it really begs the question of what the police are actually for, and what and who they are there to protect, and, you know, who is actually made vulnerable by the police. And that doesn't even include the dehumanizing and invasive behaviors like stop and search, you know, which are part and parcel of the job of police officers, you know, and it includes the behaviors that were legitimated by the Spy Cops bill, where essentially said that it was okay for undercover officers, to essentially trick people into intimate relationships. When we think about the number of people who have died following police contact, the deaths of people in prison, the immense amounts of sexual violence experienced in prison, you know, the systemic neglect experienced by those in prison, which have gone uninvestigated. And, you know, so it doesn't even need to be counted. It doesn't need to be explained. Those are all violences of the prison system that are part of business as usual. And I think that's an important conversation. And I think, you know, frankly, the response to this cannot be a reproduction of that logic. I've seen, you know, when I highlight differences in strength of the police force when it comes to, you know, defacing a statue versus dealing with sexual and gender-based violence, I'm not saying that we should make the response to gender-based violence the same as the response to defacing a statue. We saw from Sean Berry these calls to make misogyny a hate crime, and therefore grounds to arrest and bring more people into a prison system. My argument is that the carceral criminal justice system was not designed and is wholly inept to actually deal with these kinds of incidences of harm in our society. And, you know, if we think about prevention of harm, of healing from harm, a so-called justice system that is centered around punishment and the production of further harm and further trauma does not work on either of those accounts, especially when the agents of that system are given the full backing of the state and the full protection of the state to do so. And we know this from the data. We know that stronger sentences and harsher punishments do not result in lower incidences of harm or lower incidences of crime. We know that people leave prison more traumatized than when they went in. And, you know, there's a lot of far smarter people doing much better work than me, looking at what a system of accountability and harm prevention could look like. But I think that these are the kinds of questions that I think are being raised by this case, very much so.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a super difficult question. I mean, because obviously there is also the problem that, you know, so many people who are alleged to have committed rape are not convicted. So there is, on the one hand, that the police can be the perpetrators, but also it does seem like we do need a better means of policing perpetrators, right, and making sure that people do face punishment for their actions, because I think that probably would form some sort of deterrent, no, if people feel that there will be a consequence for their actions.
I would disagree with that, and the reason that I think, obviously, the question of the fact that the police do not have the tools in order to actually deal with, you know, as I said, you know, if a woman comes to the police and say, you know, this man is stalking me, you will find yourself with a big fat kind of shrug. And that actually, so there's that element that, you know, the police do not actually have the tools in order to deal with that. But the only institution that women are able to go to that promises some kind of protection from that is the police. And so I can understand that desire for conviction. I can understand it. But I think that when we look at the data, what we find is that imprisonment and incarceration and stronger sentences don't actually prevent harm as much as we think it does. And so I think it goes against a lot of our gut instincts, but I think we actually need to think of this as a much bigger conversation. This is actually it can't actually be fixed, I think personally, by simply massively expanding the rate of incarceration, because I think that essentially the data tells us that having stronger punishment does not actually have any dramatic impact on the incidences of violence. The question much more is education, and it's about tackling the root causes of those kinds of harm in order to prevent them from happening. I think it's a really difficult question. The problem is we don't have any other models that we know about, but it seems to me that the data tells me that threats of higher, you know, imprisonment don't actually do the work that we think it does. And that's a really difficult but a serious conversation that we need to have.
No, that's an important clarification. I'm sure it's a topic we'll come back to. And I'm also glad you brought up education, which is my next topic. That's because the outpouring of grief and anger in the wake of the abduction and murder of Sarah Everard has provoked many to question what men can do to tackle violence against women and the trauma it causes. On the one hand, this has included simple advice that every man can easily adopt, but there is also a widespread recognition that men need to take more fundamental changes if we are to challenge the patriarchy and not reinforce it. Society also has a broader responsibility to properly educate our children, or our adults as well, ourselves, so that boys aren't raised with the expectations that they can get away with abusing women. Ideally, they'll grow up not wanting to. Now, two people who have extensive experience speaking to men and boys about gender-based violence join me now. Nathaniel Cole is the co-founder of the Inner City Swimming Club Swim Dem Crew and workshop facilitator focusing on masculinity, relationships, and sex and anti-racism. Thank you for joining me this evening, Nathaniel.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm also joined by Saqib Ilyas Bakhtawa, who is a community and youth worker and the founder of Dicology, an anti-racist program working to build more critical, caring and resilient communities. Now, I know that both... Oh, thank you for joining me. Yeah, I know that both of you are facilitators, taking part in workshops which sort of bring in teenage boys to talk about gender-based violence, to talk about misogyny and inequality. and which is, exactly the kind of thing which it seems that there is now a political consensus. Oh, we need to teach boys about relationships. We need to teach boys about gender relations. How have you found that on the ground? Do you find that people are perceptive to thinking about sex and relationships at a young age, or is there any resistance to it? Can I start with Nathaniel?
Well, I was actually going to hand that to Sakib.
Okay, I'll start with Sakib. Go on.
Are young people receptive to it? Yeah, I think what I was thinking mostly about just now was how young people are mostly hesitant to have conversations about sex and relationships, because I think it's about how infrequently they get to happen in schools. And so when we come with that conversation quite like brazenly, there's lots of discomfort, but I think they're ready to have the conversation, but it takes a significant amount of time to get them like warmed up to have like an open conversation around it, because some kids still laugh at the word penis, which is fine, but then we do have to get past that to have kind of deeper conversations, and that's obviously dependent on age groups. Yeah.
And what are the kind of conversations you have? If you could, explain to our audience, what would a workshop look like with teenage boys or young boys or whoever you're talking to?
Yeah, I'll do like a quick run through. So we spend like we do a chunk of time on the introduction, which is mostly to set a space in a culture where young people feel comfortable to speak openly and honestly. So a lot of that is some silliness, lots of jokes, but each young person gets a chance to speak, and it allows us to build a relationship with them quite rapidly, in order for us to do the work that we need to do in the few hours that we're there. We then have an activity which is kind of like a word association, which is intended to elicit any stereotypes that exist in the group. Everybody is socialized with stereotypes, and these young people are not exempt from that. And then we do like most people might see this around like a spectrum line, where we provide statements and young people move along the lines to tell us how they feel about it. But it's to encourage the dialogue around things that they haven't really engaged before. So about emotions, about slut shaming, about if what women wear impacts how they're received or perceived by men, and pokes holes and all of those things, any beliefs that might be there. And then depending on the workshop, depending on the year group, we can do a number of things. Sometimes you have a little bit about objectification, about media and how culture perpetuates this constant bombardment of a narrative around how men and women should behave. And then there's an activity around what it means to come out, or in an attempt to like normalize different sexualities and gender identities. And then there's some other bits that we might do as an option depending on the group.
And the teachers are welcoming of this, I suppose, because you've been invited in to give this workshop, haven't you? So it's not going to be the case that you've got this misogynist teacher who's like, why are you giving me this gender ideology to my kids? I want to bring up a point which has been raised by some people on social media, which is the worry that potentially the way we talk about this, it is so widespread that means that every man is a potential perpetrator, could potentially vilify young men. Now, my prompt here is going to be a tweet this morning from Davina McCall, the television personality. So she tweeted, "Female abduction and murder is extremely rare. Yes, we should all be vigilant when out alone, but this level of fear-mongering isn't healthy, and men's mental health is an issue as well. Calling all men out as dangerous is bad for our sons, brothers, and partners." So I suppose my question here is, do you ever feel when you go into schools that the boys feel vilified? That the fact that you are there talking to them about gender-based violence is to essentially accuse them of being future perpetrators, and do you worry that could do any damage?
I think for us is that we understand that it's not all men that do this, but the general consensus from a lot of people is that it's obviously too many men. For instance, I feel like in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a narrative that's similar to today of boys, men being predisposed to violence against women and girls, which went down a route that I didn't agree with, because I feel like the way people act is a result of a series of factors. what I really think we need to do is create environments and give men tools to navigate them, you know, where they can explore deep feelings, desires, worries, fears, so they don't internalize the current power systems at play and seek to take power from people, or seek to dominate and champion abusive behaviors. For me, it's really important that we get boys to understand. I think the reason why the Sarah story is been important is because it talks about something that's talked about a lot in the media of walking home alone at night, dangerous alley. But we also need to come to terms with the fact that a lot of boys and men are capable of harm and violence, and that it's us, it's, as in someone looking at me in this camera, it's us, it's our families, it's our friends, it's our teachers, and so on. So it's not just these people that are painted as bad eggs, like rapists are known. And for us, that speaks of, you know, a culture of harm, violence, you know, what we look at as rape culture. So it's not about vilifying young boys and men, but more about developing like a community responsibility, so they understand that it's not enough to simply not do these things, but to embody a community spirit and attitude that seeks to denounce these things and go against those two.
And Saqib, can I bring you in to talk about, I suppose, how far you think education can get us? So, I mean, I think most of my audience is going to think this is a really good idea, and these workshops should be given to every boy in the country. And it's kind of ridiculous that doesn't already happen, given that we've known this is such a problem for so long. But even if that were to happen, you know, how far do you think that would get us? Where do you think the problems would still emerge? Even if we did give this wonderful education to all young boys in the country, do you still think there would still be an epidemic of gender-based violence, essentially?
Education is obviously fundamental to this. I think maybe I could speak about the approach of how we do this, and then what's needed beyond schools. And I think one of the things that we run up against quite a lot is kind of inconsistent or like infrequent opportunities to have that conversation. I think if there were a system where we could speak to young people and see them regularly throughout their school time at school, it would mean that we could support their development to be able to apply those things in real life. So I think in the approach that we have, it's about planting the seeds or the question marks on things that we believe fundamentally but don't really know where they come from, and hopefully those kind of like those little things that we've done, the little plants, the seeds that we've planted, kind of will at some point, like a trigger, like a little question mark in their head when they're having a conversation, or where they hear something, or where they see one of their friends do something. So it's about developing that kind of alternate approach to seeing things and how they navigate the world. And then I think what's really important is it does need to go beyond that, because the same conversations need to be happening at school. Sorry, they are at school. The same conversations need to be happening at home or other youth establishments, or and I think it speaks quite directly to different cultural backgrounds young people have, or if kids grow up from or belong to like a faith community. It's about having like a consistent message across all of those different areas or environments that young people spend time to to reiterate that same message. Nathaniel, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think just with you touched on it really nicely about it's about conversations that we have at home, in other wider community groups. I think to make a change and a cultural shift, you have a lot of cogs that kind of need to work together to give and equip people with the tools to navigate themselves, and to give them things like emotional literacy or comfortability with being vulnerable, or the ability to communicate effectively and not just necessarily resorting to things like violence and overpowering people. You do that through compassionate healing spaces, arts focused groups, poetry workshops, expressive dance. You know, I say those methods because they exist kind of outside the structures that have been reinforcing the power dynamics that play currently within patriarchy and masculinity. Like, I feel like we've got a community neglected society and school structure that is very much propping up a system that's creating these oppressive structures that is just repeating a cycle. And I feel like to break a cycle, you need a change that is holistic in nature, but also robust. So it engages lots of different community touch points to create a communal change over 10 or 15 years.
and Saqib, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I can see from the comments that everyone is feeling quite inspired by your project. And I mean, I really do hope that this kind of education can in the very near future be going out to every young person in the country. So yeah, thank you for sharing your insights this evening.
Thank you.
We have a final story, which is on a different topic, which is a story which I don't think is going to go away for a while, which is the controversy over nurses' pay. I think it's going to soon become the fight for a decent pay rise for nurses. At the moment, it's still at the phase of controversy instead of conflict. Earlier in the week, we said the Tories' miserly pay offer to nurses gave Labour an opportunity to regain their confidence in challenging Tory injustice. Initial signs were good. Keir Starmer led with the issues of nurses' pay and landed some real blows on Boris Johnson at this week's PMQs for only recommending a 1% pay rise for nurses, which, given inflation, would be an effective pay cut. The party strategy has hit a bit of a bump in the road, though. This is over questions of quite how much nurses' pay should be raised by. Now, the Royal College of Nurses, they are the Royal College of Nursing, they are the union which represents nurses, are proposing a 12.5% increase in pay. Labour aren't going that far. Now, they have suggested that nurses deserve at least a 2.1% pay rise. Now, that's the figure the government had originally budgeted for nurses' pay before the pandemic. They obviously changed their minds. And when they said, the money's tight now, sorry, nurses will have to pay for the crisis. In terms of the precise pay rise which Labour are proposing, the deputy leader, Angela Rayner, was pushed on the party's position on BBC Breakfast.
You're saying you are the party that's behind the NHS. And we know what the government said. They've said 1%. And the Royal College of Nursing has said 12%. So why wouldn't you, as the Labour Party, support the Royal College of Nursing's demands for 12%?
Well, there's a pay review body and a number of trade unions.
I'm asking what you think.
And a number of trade unions that are involved in that. And I think that negotiation should start. But actually, the starting point, at the very least, should be what the government had legislated and budgeted for. Because we all know that the NHS staff have put themselves at risk during this pandemic. We know we've got thousands of vacancies already across our NHS. If we give them a real terms pay cut now, we're going to have serious problems in filling those vacancies and dealing with the backlog of cancer patients that we've got and supporting our key workers that have supported us through one of the most difficult times this country has ever faced.
If
and
I
the
may,
government have broken
Angela
their
Rayner,
promise,
if I
and
may,
they should at least give 2.1%.
OK, so you're using the word at least. If I look back to the Labour Party manifesto of 2019, at that point, and this is prior to the pandemic, of course, when everyone's even more grateful and full of praise for what the NHS has done, the Labour Party manifesto 2019, you were saying they should get 5%. So, have you come down from that marker? And if you could say a number then, why can't you say a number now?
Well, we're talking about our election launch for May now. And, what we've got to remind ourselves, in that manifesto in 2019, the general public completely rejected it. It was one of our worst election defeats. So what me and Keir have done when we took over the leadership of the Labour Party is listen to voters. And if you listen to voters now, 12 months on from the start of this pandemic, they would say that the government should at least honour its promise to our NHS workers.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying not to talk. I'm trying very deliberately not to talk about the government.
I'm trying to say that our NHS staff deserve a pay rise.
No, it's not a particularly good media outing when you've gone on to attack the government where they're on the ropes. The government really unpopular for not offering nurses a pay rise here. You end up spending most of the discussion attacking yourself from a year ago. Angela Rayner stood on that manifesto, as did Keir Starmer. So they've gone on there attacking the Tories, and they end up saying, actually, the real problem was the Labour Party, who voters rejected because it was such a bad offer we promised. The substantial, takeaway from that interview is that Labour do want nurses to have a pay rise, just not a particularly substantial one. It's a very Keir Starmer position, a bit more generous than the Tories, much less so than the unions. The problem this could pose for Sir Keir is that Boris Johnson is quite a flexible Prime Minister, and it appears he might have spotted an opportunity to outflank the Labour leader. The Times report that a government source has said it was a matter of when, not if, the current 1% offer is increased. The source said ministers were considering a rise of more than the 2.1% proposed by the NHS and suggested that a rise of between 2 and 3% would be realistic. There have been suggestions of 5%, although this is very unlikely. It's also understood it's not just Labour who are publicly speaking out against the prospect of only a 1% pay rise, which would be an effective pay cut. There are also Tory backbenchers unhappy about the position. Former Minister Caroline Noakes said on ITV's Peston this week, "It's a very bad look for the government. And as I say, I was stunned that it was as low as 1%. I think we will see it go upwards. It's just a question of how much." And I think it's really important that we reflect back on the Prime Minister's words last year when he was talking about the debt, the personal debt he owed those nurses who had looked after him. And so I'm really surprised that the government came out with this recommendation, and I'm very optimistic they won't stick to it. So it seems that a U-turn is likely, and fingers crossed it comes, because as always, but especially after this pandemic, NHS staff deserve it. But if that U-turn comes, what impact could it have on the Labour Party? Now, of course, if it happens, they'll claim it was a U-turn. They'll say they've had another victory in Parliament. But that argument won't stand up particularly well if the Tories don't just match the demand of Labour, which is 2.1% or thereabouts, but go above and beyond it. If I was a Tory Prime Minister, I would certainly be tempted to make that move. And I'd be tempted not least because it would undermine the core message Labour are putting forward to vote for them in May's election. That is, vote Labour to support nurses. It is a risky move to say our whole reason for being as a party at this upcoming election is to make sure nurses are properly paid, and then only commit to offering them a pay rise of 2.1% when they're asking for 12.5%. Dalia, this looks like another own goal for the Labour Party, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the strategy, right? Like, you don't actually have an ideological framework or a politics of your own. So every time something happens, you just look and you think, okay, the Tories are here, and then when it's the case of work, the unions are here. So whatever that their position is, we'll just go like 5 degrees closer than the Tories were. But that kind of robotic approach means that you miss these golden opportunities, not just from a moral perspective, but from a political one. You know, this is exposing the government for, a whole campaign could be done here about how, exposing the government for clapping for nurses and clapping for carers and then capping their pay, right? Like, it's a simple, it's popular amongst the public. It's in line, it should be in line with, the politics of any organization that calls itself a Labour Party. It would make the Labour Party more popular and the Tories less popular. And I don't know what stage of Starmer's 3-phase plan that actually becomes the strategy, because I have yet to see it. So, maybe like in response to that kind of robotic approach, unions should adapt the strategy of just going really, really, really hard on demands, so that sort of halfway point, although it's not even really halfway, is closer to what would actually be reasonable. But for me, the whole conversation about work actually in this pandemic has been really derailed, and that's really unfortunate. Because just before the pandemic, people who do sort of underpaid, like logistical, infrastructural, urban service work, delivery drivers, taxi drivers, couriers, care workers, nurses, supermarket workers, etc., were all called, low skilled, and they were sort of weaponized in a fight to increase border security. Then suddenly they became essential workers. We all realized that not only do we really, really need them, but they're having to put their lives on the line and undergo really risky work in order to keep our society going. And, the government felt, there was this sort of brief moment where we had this really good conversation about work, and, the government felt very embarrassed that they had called this workforce, the reliance upon whom has become very, very stark. They're embarrassed that they called them low skilled. But that hasn't really yet been translated into the idea of, okay, so we recognize that these workforces are doing essential work. So now what? What does that mean? And I think, to me, that means being treated with respect, not being worked to the bone, having more than enough money to take care of yourself and your dependents and live a good life and be comfortable, having humane working conditions. It means actual material consequences that aren't just, nice words and some claps on a Thursday evening. But I think that and, thanks to the Labour Party in part, that part of the conversation has conveniently been lost.
Very much so. I also want to talk about polling, because as Angela Rayner was saying in that interview, she was basically saying our position will be led by the public. They rejected our manifesto, which said a 5% pay rise, which means that we essentially have to go for less than 5%. Otherwise, we're not listening to the voters. Well, it turns out politics doesn't actually work like that. A poll from YouGov this week asked people whether they would back a 10% rise in nursing salaries, and 75% said yes. It wasn't 75% said, oh, they might need a tiny pay rise. 75%, 10%, yes, let's do it. What's important to recognize is this is across all voting groups. It's not one of those situations where they'll say, oh, it's only the core voters. If we offer 10% to the nurses, that will just pile up votes in the inner cities where we've already got seats. No, across the country, Tory voters, Labour voters, Lib Dem voters, everyone wants a big pay rise for nurses, and so they should. It's another own goal. Come on, just take a position, a strong position, and stick to it, and you will probably have a much better electoral result than constantly trying to second guess the electorate, which is what Keir Starmer is doing at present. People see through it. I am going now to read you an advert, and this is not an advert because we have a sponsorship deal. Tysky Sour still is only supported by our kind viewers. It's an advert for a job at Novara Media, which I'm going to read to you now. Are you a versatile designer who enjoys communication and working in a team? Well, we're looking for a digital designer to join our team. Thanks to your continued support, we're constantly expanding, and right now we're looking to hire someone who can combine technical skill with creative flair in all aspects of our digital infrastructure. If this is one for you, then you could soon be working on a number of highly visible projects and designing everything from web page interactions and user experience to graphics and t-shirts. The closing date is next Wednesday, the 17th of March at 10 p.m. And for more details and information on how to apply, just go to Novara.media/designer. That's Novara.media/designer. I promise we're a very fun organization to work for. So if you are a graphic designer or a digital designer, do make sure you apply for that. I also actually have another incredibly important shout out, which is my two guests earlier. I understand in the comments people were discussing how they could get involved. So do follow them on Insta, or you can email them. So on Insta, Saqib is at Saqib, which is SAAQIB, and Nathaniel Cole is at Nathaniel A. Cole. I'll probably tweet these out afterwards, or we'll put them in the YouTube description. And what I'll actually do is I'll put the emails under the YouTube as well. That's definitely a form of political action that it's worth getting involved in. Dalia, for now, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you for having me, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for watching. If you haven't already, do make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you aren't already, please do become a supporter of Novara Media. To do that, you go to Novara.media. No, you go to novaramedia.com/support. I got confused because it's Novara.media/designer. Fox is shouting at me in my ears now. For now, you've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.